On my last day at Halcyon Strategies, I walked into the glass tower on 5th and Juniper, dressed in quiet defiance, my blazer crisp, my shoulders squared, and my resignation letter tucked into a matte black folder that I handed to the front desk like it was a ceremonial offering, not a loaded matchbook. People smiled at me like I was heading off to some tropical sabbatical, like this was a farewell full of balloons and catered cake, not the execution of a plan I had been building for 16 months with the kind of precision you don't learn in business school, but from surviving men who forget you're smarter than you look. I made no speech, shook no hands, offered no goodbyes, just walked calmly to the 22nd floor where the air always smelled like filtered power and citrus-scented deceit, and handed the envelope to Julian Crane's assistant with a smile that didn't touch my eyes. Inside the envelope was my 2-week notice, a line of polite thanks, and buried at the end, a QR code that linked to a digital memo titled Reflections on Leadership and Long-Term Risk. I knew Julian wouldn't read it, not truly. I could have carved it in marble and set it outside his office, and he still would have dismissed it as performative noise from a woman who dared to leave on her own terms. And I was right. I watched from the hallway, reflected in the angled glass beside the reception orchids, as he tore open the envelope like a bored man unwrapping socks on Christmas morning, scanned the top with a smirk, and chuckled something low to his assistant before feeding the pages one by one into the cross-cut shredder like he was doing the world a favor. I imagine it felt powerful, watching my words crinkle and disappear in neat little ribbons, but what he didn't know was that the real version wasn't in his hands. It was in the cloud, encrypted and logged and waiting. I had counted on his arrogance, on his unwillingness to look past page 1, on the fact that men like Julian only read what they respect, and he never once respected me. As I stood there watching the machine hum and buzz, chewing my legacy without a second thought, I felt a strange kind of peace, not the clean, ribbon-tied kind you get from closure, but the firelit peace that comes from knowing you're about to burn something down the right way. The QR code would remain active, the document untouched in its living form, and everything he missed, everything he laughed at, would come back to him louder than I ever could. Julian thought he shredded a letter, but what he actually did was cut the fuse on a quiet little bomb, and page 3 was ticking. Page 3 was never meant for him, not really, because men like Julian Crane never get to the 3rd page unless it names them directly, or flatters their legacy, and mine did neither. It sat buried like a landmine in the middle of a 17-page document he never had the patience to read, marked only by a dull gray subheading labeled Historical Concerns and Irregularities. And I knew that even if he had skimmed it, his eyes would have slid off the coded language like oil on glass. That page was written for the people who knew where the bodies were buried, but were too afraid to say it aloud, the ones who had quietly forwarded me emails at midnight or knocked gently on my office door after hours with stories that cracked and trembled as they spoke. Page 3 held 12 entries, each short and clinical, nothing loud or dramatic, just enough to rattle the ground if someone bothered to connect the dots. It started with a merger approval that happened 3 weeks before the board ever voted on it, continued with 3 NDAs filed under the legal shell of Halcyon International Holdings, not Halcyon Strategies, so they'd never appear on our books, then shifted into a sudden firing that coincided suspiciously with a whistleblower complaint we were told had been withdrawn. There was the DEI audit that was never completed, the promised bonuses that disappeared after a fake cybersecurity breach, and a memo time-stamped and screenshotted where Julian referred to a disabled analyst as a cost center with legs. Every line on that page was paired with footnotes and references, file numbers that led to secure cloud archives I'd backed up twice, and dates that would stand up in any courtroom, boardroom, or headline. I had spent over a year collecting them, not because I wanted revenge, but because I couldn't keep lying to myself about the kind of place I worked for. A place that handed out branded notebooks about transparency while shredding actual evidence in the executive suite. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want a settlement. I wanted air, sunlight, space, truth. Page 3 was my attempt to open a window in a room that had been sealed shut for too long, and even if Julian never read it, someone would. I made sure of that. The link wasn't just hidden in my resignation memo. It was sent to a burner inbox at the Department of Labor, to a private journalist I trusted with my whole chest, and to the inbox of a former Halcyon VP who left abruptly after a retreat no one talked about anymore. Julian could laugh, could shred, could gloat over his shallow little performance, but the page he ignored was the page that mattered most. And if there's one thing I've learned from working with predators in tailored suits, it's that their downfall never starts with a scream. It starts with a whisper written in footnotes. The truth is, I started collecting receipts the day I realized no one in that building would ever collect them for me. There wasn't a single light bulb moment, no dramatic betrayal or shouted accusation across a glossy conference table. It was quieter than that. It was the way Julian would smirk whenever I spoke up in meetings, how he'd repeat my exact ideas minutes later, and somehow they sounded brilliant only when they came from his mouth. It was watching Elena from HR cry in the stairwell after a leadership review that ranked her emotionally inconsistent because she had taken 3 days off to bury her father. It was noticing how the interns of color never made it past their 6-month contracts, how our DEI reports were always in development until the headlines cooled. So I did what most women do when we're told to be grateful for the very floor we're allowed to stand on. I smiled, I nodded, and I started writing everything down. I bought a blank notebook and labeled it Strategy Reflections in case anyone peeked. Inside, it held no strategies, only transcribed conversations from behind closed doors, jotted down while they were still fresh in my head, with timestamps and initials, even the room numbers when I could remember. I forwarded emails to an encrypted Proton mail address I set up under a false name, every file renamed with innocuous titles like Lunch Options Q4 or Team Wellness Survey. I recorded Zoom calls on my personal device by pretending to take notes, quietly setting my phone face down with voice memo running in airplane mode, and kept the files tucked inside a password-protected cloud folder that only I could access. I never moved hastily. I never flinched. I knew that if I were caught gathering anything real, they'd make me disappear from the org chart faster than you could spell non-disclosure. So I wore their language like armor. I asked for clarification in Slack threads where other people could see. I requested things in writing. I acted forgetful just long enough to make them repeat themselves where it could be captured. And when things got especially dark, when I learned about the marketing assistant whose NDA came with a therapist stipend and a silence clause, I didn't cry. I booked a conference room, closed the door, and typed it all out as a risk mitigation proposal that I never sent. I was never trying to be a hero. I was just trying not to lose my mind in a place where gaslighting came with a free catered lunch and a branded tote bag. Every receipt I saved was a breadcrumb in a maze they thought I'd never find my way out of. But I wasn't lost. I was mapping the exits, and by the time I handed in my badge and they laughed at my resignation, what they didn't realize was that I wasn't walking away. I was walking towards something they never saw coming. The thing about nepotism is that it never knocks when it enters the room. It just assumes the seat at the head of the table and waits for you to serve the coffee. When Julian announced that his son Mason would be shadowing leadership for the quarter, there was a moment of stunned silence, so polite you could hear the HR director's lip twitch. Mason was 26, wore designer sneakers with his suits, and once asked me if procurement was a kind of meal plan. He had no resume, no record, no grasp of internal systems or vendor protocols. But he had one thing that outshined all our degrees and decades combined. He was Julian's son. At first, they framed it as a mentorship opportunity, a way for him to absorb culture from the ground up. But within weeks, Mason had an office bigger than mine and was suddenly approving projects I had spent months structuring. I was told to CC him on all my correspondence, then told to reroute key decisions through him, then told to stop questioning his changes because they were vision-aligned. I watched as invoices doubled under his sign-off, as vendor names I had never seen before began appearing on the ledger with round figures and vague scopes like strategic enhancement and culture pivot. He once greenlit a 6-figure campaign to a firm run by his former roommate, and when I raised concerns, Julian chuckled and called it next-gen networking. But the most infuriating part wasn't the financial rot or the favoritism. It was the expectation that we should all be flattered to orbit him. Mason would pop into meetings late with a latte in hand and start sentences with "Dad thinks," as though every word from his mouth carried boardroom scripture. I was no longer invited to certain project calls. My strategy documents were stripped of my name before being passed upstairs, and my insights began showing up in presentations I hadn't been asked to attend. At first, it felt like erasure, like the slow peeling of my fingerprints off the work I had bled into. But then I realized that being pushed out of the circle gave me the clearest view of its cracks. I started noticing patterns, flagged discrepancies, saved emails where Mason contradicted himself within the same thread. I wasn't bitter, I was collecting. Because the thing about golden children is that they think the world is their inheritance, but they never bother learning how the vaults are actually built. And when they break the lock, they think no one will notice the glitter they stole wasn't theirs. I did. I noticed. I wrote it down. And while Mason smiled for the cameras and signed deals he didn't understand, I stayed quiet in the margins, gathering enough proof to rewrite the ending. They thought I had been sidelined. They didn't know I was building the story they'd never be able to bury. They always start with the word concerned, as if concern is some soft wool blanket they can drape over the fact that they are sharpening knives behind their backs. The day I voiced my unease about the vendor inconsistencies Mason had approved, I wasn't met with curiosity or correction. I was met with a thin smile from my supervisor and a reminder that loyalty is a form of leadership. A week later, I was called into a meeting with HR about my tone in internal threads and how it might be creating a hostile perception. Not an actual hostile environment, mind you, just the whiff of one, like smoke they could point to even though no fire had ever been seen. They labeled me emotional, a classic move, used not because I had raised my voice or cried at my desk, but because I had made the mistake of caring with precision. My strategy notes were suddenly difficult to follow, my leadership style too assertive, and my once celebrated initiatives were now framed as out of alignment with company direction. Within 2 months, I was demoted without the title change, my team reassigned without my input, and my calendar began to fill with vague performance check-ins. It was like being ghosted in slow motion, watching your value drip out of the room while they told you how much they appreciated your hard work. The final act came in a white envelope, hand-delivered by someone from HR who couldn't meet my eyes, a severance package that looked generous if you didn't know what I had built, stapled to an NDA so thick it could have been a novella. It forbade me from speaking about my termination circumstances, from disclosing any confidential learnings, and most importantly, from pursuing legal remedy. I flipped through the pages while the HR rep awkwardly offered me a bottle of water, as if hydration would soothe the sting of betrayal. I nodded, pretended to be grateful, asked for time to review it with a lawyer. What they didn't know was that I had already spoken to one. What they didn't know was that the NDA had its own folder in my encrypted drive, along with 3 years of notes, receipts, and audio files labeled in code. I walked out of that room with the envelope tucked under my arm like it was a party favor I had no intention of using. They thought they had silenced me. They thought the signature line would be the end of the story. But I had no plans to pick up the pen. I was not there to be quiet. I was there to make sure every page they tried to bury became a headline they could never outrun. They were never meant to be dramatic, not at first, just quiet observations jotted down in the margins of my planner or typed into the notes app during lunch breaks, each one a thread I couldn't stop pulling until the whole tapestry started to unravel in my hands. I started calling them the 12, not out loud, of course, but in the log I kept privately and obsessively updated in a folder labeled Canary, because even the smallest voice in a poisoned mind should be enough to warn the others. Bombshell 1 was the most obvious and the least surprising, a fake vendor registered under the name of a college friend of Mason's, approved for a 6-figure contract with no deliverables and an address that led to a closed-down vape shop in Queens. Bombshell 2 was personal, a pattern of harassment complaints filed against the same senior VP, all quietly dismissed after internal review, but I had screenshots of the email chains and the time-stamped Slack messages that had mysteriously vanished from the server 2 weeks later. Bombshell 3 came by accident, a conversation I overheard between Julian and the board liaison in the elevator when they thought they were alone, casually discussing how to offload underperforming assets before a merger announcement to avoid triggering SEC reporting requirements. I remember pretending to scroll my phone while my heart thudded like a drumline in my chest. Bombshell 4 was a little subtler, more like rot beneath paint. The way employee surveys were edited before board presentations to remove references to burnout, discrimination, and toxic management. Bombshell 5 was the digital equivalent of a smoking gun, a pattern of calendar invites that mapped perfectly onto the timeline of a junior staffer's sudden disappearance. A woman who had been too afraid to go public and had left with a severance package and eyes full of shame. Bombshells 6 through 9 were financial gymnastics, expense reports tied to non-existent travel, inflated projections for acquisitions that never happened, and internal forecasts massaged to keep investor decks shiny while the foundation quietly crumbled. Bombshell 10 was hidden in the minutes of a strategy meeting, a single comment made by Mason about cleansing the culture, followed by the abrupt departure of 3 employees over 40. Bombshell 11 came from Camille in compliance, passed to me under the guise of lunch banter, a flag document showing Julian's private investment into a direct competitor 6 weeks before we lost the bid to them. And Bombshell 12, the one that kept me up at night, was the realization that all of this wasn't negligence or incompetence. It was design. It was a system built not to succeed, but to deceive. I organized every file, every note, every voice memo with the precision of someone filing a will, not because I expected it to be read, but because I needed to know, in some dark corner of the future, the truth had been named. 12 truths, 12 wounds, and all of them bleeding quietly beneath the surface. If you ask Julian Crane who the biggest threat in his company was, he would have probably pictured someone loud and disobedient, someone who stormed into boardrooms with protest signs or slammed fists onto glass tables in a room full of suits. But the truth is, the real threat was always in the quiet ones, the ones who watched and remembered, who moved like whispers through hallways and never raised their voice unless it was to whisper a warning. Dev Patel from finance had been one of those people, unassuming in his knit cardigans and neutral expressions, always sipping coffee from the same chipped mug and nodding through meetings like he'd rather be anywhere else. But I saw him once, lingering too long on a financial report I had flagged, eyes narrowing at numbers that didn't make sense, the corner of his mouth tightening like he was biting back what he knew. I waited until the week after my demotion, when I had nothing left to lose, and asked him flat out in the break room if he had ever noticed patterns that didn't add up. He didn't answer right away, just handed me a spreadsheet and walked away, and when I opened it, there were red marks, dates circled, anomalies noted with a precision only someone fluent in numbers and buried truths could deliver. Monique Laramie was harder to approach. She worked in legal, wore heels that echoed like punctuation down the halls, and had the kind of posture that said she had buried secrets for a living. We weren't friends, not really, but I had once seen her slip a tissue to an intern crying in the stairwell after being chewed out by Mason, and that was enough for me to take the risk. I left a sticky note on her desk, nothing incriminating, just a time and place. She showed up. She always showed up. When I explained what I'd been collecting, she didn't gasp or look away. She just asked to see the log. Then she asked for a burner drive. Then she asked how long I had been building it. Over the next few weeks, the 3 of us formed a rhythm, a silent current beneath the office's surface, checking timestamps, pulling old files from archived servers, tracing legal memos that contradicted Julian's public statements. Monique had access to internal audits and past settlements, things I never knew existed. Dev could follow a trail through vendor payments and expense reports like a bloodhound. I was the architect, but they were the builders who helped reinforce every beam. We didn't speak more than we had to in public. A nod in the elevator, a shared glance at the copier. But at night, in encrypted chat threads and hushed conversations at diners that took cash only, we became something sharp and deliberate, not revenge. Not sabotage, just truth. Organized, time-stamped, legally sound truth, ready for whatever storm we were brave enough to walk into together. The memo everyone thought was just a PDF was never meant to be read like a bedtime story, printed out and flipped through with bored fingers in a corner office where truth got fed into shredders for sport. What I built wasn't a document. It was a live archive, a breathing ecosystem of evidence, timelines, receipts, cross-referenced reports, and audio transcriptions tied together in a digital vault I named Canary, a nod to the ones they always sent into the mines first, the ones who died so others didn't have to. The real canary sat behind an encrypted wall on a secure cloud platform that not even Dev or Monique could access unless everything went sideways. I designed it with layers, smart links embedded in footnotes, collapsible folders that unfurled timelines with one click, and tagged keywords that could pull every instance of financial misconduct or internal discrimination policy violation with surgical precision. And then I buried the access where no executive would ever look, not in an email, not in a printed resignation letter, but in the tiny corner of Halcyon's farewell Slack emoji, a yellow bird. No tears, no fanfare, just a subtle flick of digital plumage where my smiley face used to be. I knew the real ones would catch it. The people who had sat quietly in all-hands meetings while Mason fumbled through announcements he didn't understand. The analysts who watched promotion after promotion skip over desks full of talent. The women in legal who walked out of glass-walled rooms with clenched jaws and still came back the next morning. The canary emoji sat there for hours, then days, mostly ignored, a small oddity in the stream of gifs and cake emojis and hollow goodbyes. But then the pings started. One from Clara in procurement, another from Jonah in IT, just emojis at first, little bird icons, eyes wide, then came the side messages, cautious but curious. Did you mean to leave that? Is there more to the memo? I didn't respond directly. Canary wasn't meant for everyone. It was for the ones who had kept their heads down long enough to know when to look up. Inside the archive, I had left instructions for what to do if I ever disappeared, if HR tried to bury me in paperwork, or if the company tried to spin the story. Time-stamped voice memos, legal citations, password-protected folders titled with phrases like Q, for kickback trail, and NDAs and patterns. It was all there, breathing quietly in the cloud, waiting for a spark. I didn't know who would light it or when, but I had faith in the slow burn. Truth doesn't always scream when it enters a room. Sometimes it perches, waits, and watches the whole empire lean just a little too far over the edge. And when it does, the canary sings. I knew better than to go straight to the top, not when the air up there was thick with cigar smoke and non-disclosure agreements. Not when every journalist with a national platform had a golf photo or a conference dinner tied to someone on Halcyon's board. So I went to someone who used to know what it felt like to be invisible. Her name was Elise Park, and 3 years ago she was just another underpaid junior analyst working 3 laptops deep in a cubicle beside mine, surviving on granola bars and late-night anxiety. She left quietly after being pushed out for asking too many questions about a missing line item in Q2's expense reports, but she didn't disappear. She reemerged as a rising voice on a blog called Signal and Smoke, a place where whispers turned into stories and stories turned into consequences. I created a burner email, scrubbed every trace of metadata, and sent her just a breadcrumb first, a 2-line note referencing something only someone who had sat through Julian's infamous culture realignment meetings would know. No attachments, no links, just curiosity bait. She responded with a single word, ready. That was all I needed. I sent her a locked PDF with a separate message containing the passphrase, something only she would get, a phrase I used to write on Post-its during our worst days together at Halcyon. Integrity is not a liability. She opened it. I could tell because 5 minutes later the blog went dark. Maintenance mode, her way of saying she was reading and cross-checking. I waited 2 more days before the second transfer, this time a deeper cut, a trimmed and redacted version of page 3 from my memo, the one with the 12 incidents coded in neutral language, enough to verify, but not enough to trace directly to me unless you already knew where to look. Meanwhile, Julian was on a podcast talking about his vision for ethical leadership and the future of corporate responsibility, using words like transparency and synergy like they weren't rotting in the basement of every decision he'd signed off on. I watched the interview in my pajamas, coffee in hand, and smiled when he said he'd never seen any documentation of internal concern. By then, Elise's first article was already in review, slated for early next week, cross-checked by 2 independent legal experts, and paired with a second piece built on an interview with someone from facilities who had forwarded me time-stamped maintenance logs. It wasn't a whistle, it was a whisper. But whispers have a way of echoing when they hit the right walls. I didn't need to scream or sign a press release. I just needed the truth to be louder than their denial. And I had planted it gently in a place where they would never think to look until it bloomed into something undeniable. By the time Julian shredded the memo, the leak had already begun. And the best part was, it didn't even look like one. It started as a ripple, barely a tremor, the kind of thing executives brush off like lint on a tailored suit. But by midweek, it had grown teeth. Shareholders, those distant titans who usually only showed up for dividends and golf retreats, began asking questions with a kind of precision that didn't leave much room for Julian's usual fog and mirrors routine. "What's the deal with this supposed canary leak?" That was the line quoted in the meeting notes that landed in my inbox through one of the same encrypted backdoors I used to file canary in the first place. The phrasing wasn't hostile, but it carried the tone of someone checking the locks on a door they had never questioned before. I watched it all from my apartment, hair in a bun, soup simmering on the stove, my laptop screen split between the Signal and Smoke homepage and the shareholder meeting livestream, which someone had, bless them, quietly uploaded to a private link meant for investors only. Julian looked tired in a way he didn't know how to perform his way out of, the lighting above his desk too harsh, revealing the kind of eye bags that even loyalty bonuses could not hide. He started with one of his signature platitudes, a fluffy word salad about misinformation and disgruntled former employees. But the call wasn't full of nodding department heads or HR shields. These were people with stock portfolios the size of small nations and legal teams that could smell risk like sharks smell blood. When one woman from the West Coast, her voice steely and dispassionate, asked whether Halcyon had ever conducted a third-party audit of internal complaints since Mason Crane's promotion, Julian paused, mouth open just enough to show his panic, but not wide enough to let a coherent answer escape. Someone coughed. Someone else repeated the question. It became clear, almost laughably so, that he hadn't read past the first page of the memo, that he thought shredding a few printed pages could cauterize a fire already moving through the ducts. The board called an emergency executive session less than 20 minutes later, a digital curtain slamming down while investors were still mid-question. The livestream cut to a placeholder graphic, a soft blue screen with the company's mission statement looping like a broken hymn. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words replay in my head, that nauseating line they all clung to in interviews. Halcyon believes in brave innovation and quiet leadership. Brave, maybe. Quiet, not anymore. It struck me then how small their fortress really was, how easily the drawbridge buckled when you stopped yelling at the front gate and instead just mailed the blueprints to the townsfolk. My hands didn't tremble. My breath didn't hitch. I just sat there with a spoon in my hand and the scent of ginger and broth in the air, watching the kingdom I used to serve realize that the moat wasn't wide enough to keep the truth from walking straight in. It was a Tuesday when the video dropped, the kind of gray-skied morning where the world feels like it's holding its breath. And I was halfway through my coffee when the group chat lit up with a link from Monique. No subject line, just the words, "They used it." My pulse quickened before I even clicked. It was the follow-up piece on Signal and Smoke, and right in the first paragraph, bolded like a flashing light in a dark tunnel, was the phrase, "archived Zoom footage from an internal Halcyon meeting." I knew what it was before I even scrolled down. Months ago, when I had still been quietly gathering receipts like breadcrumbs in a forest filled with wolves, Monique had screen-recorded a team-wide finance meeting after we noticed Mason was signing off on vendors that didn't actually exist in our accounting system. That call had been forgettable in every way except one. At the 36-minute mark, Julian had leaned back in his chair, sipping what I still think was his lunchtime bourbon in a coffee mug, and cracked a joke about wiping trails cleaner than a politician's inbox. Everyone had laughed, because that's what you did around Julian, even if the joke sounded too much like the truth and not nearly enough like satire. But Monique had saved it. Not just the video, but the meeting chat, the metadata, the time codes, the proof that this wasn't fabricated or lifted out of context. The blog embedded the clip right in the center of the article, and it autoplayed when you hovered. The views were climbing by the thousands every time I refreshed. Twitter, LinkedIn, Reddit, even TikTok got hold of it, stitching together duets of finance professionals reacting in disbelief. lip-reading Julian's smug smile like it was a crime scene. By evening, major outlets had picked it up, and Halcyon's own social media pages had either gone dark or locked down, as if silence might erase the sound of his voice echoing across the internet. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. Not the way I thought I would. It wasn't fireworks or vindication with a victory lap. It was quieter than that. A kind of sobering affirmation that I hadn't been imagining things. That the gaslighting and the belittling and the NDAs weren't just unfortunate office politics, but part of a larger, rotting structure now cracking in public. I texted Monique a single word, "Thank you," and she replied with a heart and a shrug emoji, as if casually archiving corporate misconduct was just another Tuesday task. Maybe for her, it had been. Maybe we all knew, deep down, that this day would come, that someone would open the wrong email or click play at just the right time, and the whole illusion would unravel. Not with an explosion, but with a screen recording quietly surfacing in a blog post that refused to look away. It started with a whisper, the kind of internal shuffle that doesn't set off alarms right away but moves like water through cracks. Slow and quiet until one morning the floor is soaked. I was sitting on my couch in sweats, eating leftover noodles and watching the view count tick upward on the Signal and Smoke article when I got a text from Monique. HR submitted something. Joint letter. You were cited. My fork froze mid-air. I sat up, noodles forgotten, and called her immediately. She didn't answer, but 30 seconds later, she forwarded a redacted version of the document that was making its way to the board. And there it was, in plain black and white, a formal statement signed by 3 women in human resources, none of whom had ever shown more than polite neutrality during my time at Halcyon, but whose names I recognized as gatekeepers of the company's most tightly wound secrets. They weren't dramatic women. They weren't known for making noise. But somewhere in the mess that followed the Canary leak and the viral video, something in them had cracked open, and now their words were fire. They listed 7 misconduct cases that had been buried or redirected, including 2 anonymous reports I knew had disappeared without explanation during my tenure. They wrote about pressure from executive leadership to soften language, delay investigations, or reroute complaints through Mason's inner circle. And then, halfway down page 2, they named me. Not as a whistleblower, but as a catalyst. Ava Chen's memo shed light on a pattern we were previously discouraged from acknowledging. The sentence read, as clinical as it was electric, and it confirmed details we had suspected, but could not formally corroborate. My breath caught. These were women who had been cornered by the same machine, maybe not in the same ways, but chewed up nonetheless. And now they were burning their fear like kindling. I could picture them in their 3rd-floor glass office, once the most silent corner of the building, huddled over a laptop, watching the Canary memo surface like a ghost they thought had been buried for good. Maybe they hadn't trusted me back then. Maybe they thought I would vanish like the others. But now, with Julian's smirk plastered across the internet and shareholders dialing in like vultures, they had decided to pick up the match and strike it against the company's polished veneer. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if they'd be protected or if Halcyon would try to spin it as internal confusion or procedural error, but I knew this. The silence had cracked. The women who had once redacted my file were now citing it, not with caution but conviction. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. The cracks were widening, and the flood was coming. Julian's statement dropped like a rusted coin into a dry fountain, loud enough to echo for a moment but not nearly enough to buy him redemption. He called it an unfortunate case of unauthorized document circulation and internal confusion, dressed it up in the kind of PR jargon that makes real accountability vanish like breath on a mirror. He didn't even say my name, just referred to me as a former employee, and claimed the memo had been misconstrued and improperly shared without context. I almost laughed when I read it, not because it was clever, but because it was so painfully transparent, the flailing of a man who thought branding could undo chronology. What Julian failed to remember, or maybe never realized in the first place, was that I had built the Canary archive like a prosecution case, not a diary. Every file had a timestamp. Every document had version control. Every audio clip had a corresponding metadata sheet with origin details and keyword tags. I had organized it with the precision of someone who knew they would be questioned. Someone who had seen firsthand how quickly truth gets painted over when power is in the hands of the guilty. When people clicked the QR code and landed in the canary cloud, they weren't met with vague accusations or blurry screenshots. They were met with folders labeled by date, by department, by type of misconduct. They found Slack exports with highlighted keywords, PDF renderings of spreadsheets that had been lost in the shared drive, audio snippets from town halls where Julian joked about regulators like they were mosquitoes to be swatted. They found footnotes and cross-references, links that connected one event to the next, like train tracks leading straight to the center of the fire. So when his press release hit the news cycle, full of evasive language and half-lies, it unraveled almost instantly. Journalists began matching his timeline to the one in Canary, and the gaps widened into craters. One reporter tweeted a side-by-side comparison of his claims versus the documents, and it went viral within the hour. My favorite comment read, "You can't lie about a fire when someone's already uploaded the smoke." People began quoting page numbers, referencing exhibits like it was a courtroom. By evening, even the more conservative outlets had picked it up, not because they wanted to, but because the story had outgrown spin. Julian had spent his career building narratives, massaging truth until it bent in his favor, but this time the truth was stone, not string, and he had nothing to tug on. Watching it all unfold felt like standing in the middle of a storm I had forecasted to the minute. I didn't need to gloat, didn't need to say a word. The archive spoke louder than I ever could. And Julian, the man who once called me forgettable, was now being dissected by the very receipts he didn't think I was smart enough to save. The offers came in like a sudden downpour on dry ground, glossy names in my inbox that once would have thrilled me. Firms that used to feel out of reach now stumbling over each other to offer me titles, budgets, and corner offices that smelled of redemption, but all I felt was stillness. Something had cracked open in me, not with bitterness, but with clarity, the kind that doesn't need applause to know it is right. I read the offers politely, even took a few calls out of curiosity, listening as they praised my courage and strategic mind. But beneath the compliments was the same old machinery I had spent years trying to dismantle. What they wanted was not Ava Chen, but the fire I had started, and I wasn't going to hand them the matchbook just to see it burn the wrong house. So I took my laptop, my peace, and the thick skin I had earned like calluses, and I started page 3 strategies from the small table in my apartment, the one by the window where the light hits just right around 10:30 in the morning. I named it after the page he never read, the page that unraveled a dynasty, because I wanted it to stand for more than my story. I wanted it to be a blueprint for others like me, the ones labeled too ambitious or too difficult or too principled, the ones who document quietly, who sit through meetings recording every microaggression in the back of their mind until they're ready to leave with receipts and grace. We don't do revenge here, we do accountability. We don't destroy for sport. We rebuild on the ashes of what failed us. Page 3 Strategies offers exit planning that protects people before the storm hits, trainings for executives who say they want to change but don't know where to begin, and private consultations for whistleblowers who are done being afraid. I have clients who speak in whispers, who meet me off-site and slide envelopes across coffee tables like spies, and I tell them the truth, which is that fear is real, but silence costs more. Monique joined me part-time as legal advisor. Dev consults when financial patterns start looking suspicious. And we built this thing slowly, intentionally, like a house with no corners to hide in. A year ago, I was writing resignation letters in secret, afraid to breathe too loud. Now I speak on panels about power and the ways it disguises itself. And I get messages from strangers who say, "Your story helped me save mine." I don't know if Julian ever thinks about page 3 or the memo or the fallout that followed, but I do. Not with hate, but with purpose. Because this house, the one I built, stands taller, not in spite of what he tried to do to me, but because of it. And every brick is proof that silence never had the last word. The room was full of suits, sharp collars, and sharper smiles, the kind of crowd that used to make me nervous. But today I felt calm, like the eye in the middle of a storm I had already survived. The screen behind me displayed my name and the title of my talk, "They Only Read What They Respected," in clean serif font, But it was the silence before I spoke that held the most weight. I took the stage without notes, without apology, and let the truth speak in my own voice, measured and clear. I told them about the memo, the page, the footnotes, and the men who never looked past what they thought they could control. I told them about Julian Crane, how he shredded my exit memo 30 minutes after laughing at it in front of a room full of VPs who clapped because they were trained to, not because they understood. I told them he missed page 3 entirely, skipped it like a preface in a book he assumed was beneath him, and that one blind spot cost him his name, his legacy, and eventually his board seat. The irony of it all still tasted like steel on my tongue. That memo, the one they called petty and dramatic and hushed conversations, ended up being the most downloaded PDF in the history of the firm's shared drive after it leaked. I smiled when I said it, not out of pride, but because it proved what I had always known. People don't skim what they fear, they skim what they think won't matter, and they don't realize their mistake until it is too late. I paused as I told them that documents don't get louder with volume. They get louder with detail, with dates and timestamps and truths that stack until they become undeniable. I looked around the room and I could tell some of them still didn't get it. They thought I was there to inspire. I was not. I was there to warn. To remind them that the quiet ones are not weak, that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one taking notes. After the talk, a young woman in a navy blazer approached me, eyes wide and unsure, and asked how I knew when it was time to speak up. I told her you never know, not really, but you document anyway, you build anyway, because when the moment comes, and it will, you don't want to be empty-handed. As I stepped off the stage and the applause followed me like a tide, I thought of Julian again, the way his face looked in that grainy leaked Zoom clip, how his jaw locked when he realized someone had been listening all along. He never respected the page, because he never respected the writer, and that, in the end, was the memo he should have read first.